I'd like to preface this video by saying there is no ill intention towards either of these films. Yes, I have my preferences just like anybody else, but more than preferring which one I think is better, I prefer to take the time to dissect and figure out what makes each one tick. So, in this video for the Borealis company, we're going to take a look at two stories that I think are very parallel to each other and why I think one works while the other one not so much. The Secret Life of Walter Mitty and Hector and the Search for Happiness.
Listen to this.
Many people only see happiness in their future.
Even though both of these stories were panned by critics, and I think harshly and incorrectly so, especially when you read the actual reviews and how much people like to hear themselves, one built up a very healthy and very endearing cult following over the years, while the other one, well, kind of fell off the face of the earth on impact. I think some of it did have to deal with the fact that Walter Mitty came out a year earlier, so Hector felt kind of like a copycat to some degree. But I think there's a lot here, so I just want to start unpacking this with the first point: CTAs. In marketing, this is short for a call to action, but for both of these videos, it's a call to adventure. But what we need to acknowledge is sometimes a call to adventure is just not strong enough to feel legitimate. Most people who watch videos like this on YouTube already know what Walter Mitty is about, but just in case you don't, it's about a negative assets manager who gets the news that his company, Life magazine, is printing its last copy before it goes under, and he must find the company's most well-respected photographer to retrieve the photo that will ultimately be the front cover. That's pretty much common knowledge at this stage if you watch these kinds of videos. Hector and the Search for Happiness is about a psychiatrist who is fed up with the mundanity of his life, so he travels around the world to study what makes people happy. On paper, both of these feel like pretty solid feel-good movies, but when you start digging a little bit, and I think the big difference between what makes Walter's call to adventure more exciting than Hector's is the force and the motivation. Walter's motivated by an external force that pries him out of his shell. He goes on this adventure because his job and the rest of the employees are at stake, even though he knows it's a dying company. But he continues to do so even after he's been fired. Hector does it to say that he's helping his clients, when in reality, he's doing it to avoid the obligations that come with the sedentary life that he has. One feels like he discovers life along the way, while the other realizes he has Peter Pan syndrome and just needs to grow the hell up. One is an introvert who must be extroverted. The other is an introvert who tries to stay introverted. It's a lot easier to not change when you have all the control in your story. Next, I want to talk about thematic coherence. I think this is where Hector and the Search for Happiness really shines. It's got a very enticing premise that would resonate as a positive flick. A psychiatrist whose job it is to make people happy isn't happy, so he tries to discover it for himself. But there's something about it that I think hinders it, which I mentioned kind of in the last portion, and I'll explain kind of more in the next portion. But this is one of those stories that I think would work better in a different medium. The film is based on a French novel, and while I haven't read the novel, I think that's where it would really shine, because it's such an internal conflict. Literature is one of, if not the best way to write stories like that, because they have to be visualized or imagined within the mind of the reader. And if it's so internal, like how it is in Hector and the Search for Happiness, maybe the audience would have a better time digesting what was going on in Hector's head. Cinema is a little more difficult to do that, but it's not impossible. I just think that this is a story that works better on the page rather than the screen. Then, you take a look at the Secret Life of Walter Mitty. A man whose job it is to process photos of life has to take a life-changing adventure to find one that captures the quintessence of life. If it was Scrabble, Walter wins by a fat mile. Editor's note, that's not true. They would actually tie. But everything revolves down to the practicality of the film. The film is actually shot on film. Every frame looks like it would be a contender for Life magazine. By finding something that captures the quintessence of life, Walter, as a result, and maybe as a side effect, finds his own quintessence. Don't get me wrong, there are actually a lot of beautiful shots in Hector and the Search for Happiness, but in this case, it's really hard to hold a candle against Stuart Dryburgh's work. And finally, we're going to take a look at the journeys themselves. Something that I think goes into every element of a good story is that they should feel like they're there for a reason. That being said, you probably know how I feel now about red herrings and occasionally MacGuffins, but I think that's especially important for places on a journey. Both of these characters go around the world and back. Hector goes from London to China to Africa to LA and then back to London. Walter goes from New York to Greenland, back to New York, then to the Afghan Himalayas, then to LA, then back to New York. But even though both of them chose the places that they went, Walter's was more of a template because he was in pursuit of a global travel photographer, and therefore that gave him just enough agency to not actually have agency. Hector chose, maybe even hand-picked, every country he went to, typically because he knew people in those areas, with the exception of China. Again, it goes back to agency. He chose just enough to not actually have to change. Not to mention, everything that happens to Hector could have happened to him in London. He could have gone to a place like Annabelle's, gotten a one-night stand, hit the wrong road, almost get a Glasgow smile, recuperated, and then met up with a colleague that he used to have a fling with at the neuroscience program in Oxford. See what I mean? But if he instead looked up the happiest countries, hit those spots, and then found his way to the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, which, from my research, is academically the go-to place to study happiness, it would have been a different story because each of those has more of a function to his journey. And then, maybe, serendipitously, you write in his points of contact based on those locations. Walter Mitty hits the spots that he does based on the clues that he has to find the photographer. They have more of a reason and therefore a purpose, but at the same time, I think Hector picked those spots because, again, it's easier for him to run away from his own life. All that to say, Walter Mitty seems like a more enjoyable film because Walter feels like a more heroic character than Hector. He's taking a journey that feels more like it's taking him, and he becomes a better person because of it. Now, again, please don't think I don't like Hector in the Search for Happiness. At one point in time, in fact when I first saw it, it was in my top 10 favorite films of all time, with Walter being somewhere in my top 25. Now it's reversed drastically. Walter Mitty is in my top 10 easily, and Hector in Search for Happiness is maybe in my top 100. But that being said, if I was a film producer and I heard the premise for this story, as both an American and the son of a third-generation therapist who he himself went to trade school for therapy, I would greenlight this in a heartbeat. But I would change some things. Firstly, I would want the film to make bolder decisions. From the color grading to the choice of location, I would want everything to feel more deliberate even if the protagonist is not. And additionally, and I think this would help with Hector and especially his girlfriend, who as a character I really did not like, I wouldn't greenlight it as a movie, but instead as a miniseries. And then give each location its own fleshed out episode. Like there would be a China episode, an Africa episode, and an LA episode, etc. I think if it had better pacing overall, I would actually have time to understand and even like the characters more. But that's just my 2 cents. What do you think of these films? Have you seen both of them? Have you even heard of them? Do you have a preference? What do you think needs to happen for a good globe-trotting journey? Leave it in the comments and consider subscribing for more insight and original work on storytelling.
This is a place of business, not a place of jelly man toys. Get off it! It's mine! Give it to me! No!